Loading. Welcome to Access the Animus.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new video here on Access the Animus. Today we're continuing our analysis of the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC of Assassin's Creed Valhalla by delving a bit more into the newly introduced Salakar artifact, its function, and its potential ties to Assassin's Creed 3 and Valhalla's main game, before moving on to discuss the various events taking place before the ending of the DLC, including Baldr's death, which happened off-screen. We're also going to delve into the secret documents of a North African Isu Scientist and the references to the various characters that they contain, some more general information on the conscience transference technology used by the Ancient Isu, and some references to the assassination of Jupiter's parents. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it, subscribing to our channel and turning the notifications on so you won't miss any of our future updates. And with that out of the way, let's dive into the new episode of our Dawn of Ragnarok analysis. We ended off in the last episode of this series when Odin reached Atri, the heavily bombed city of the Isu, here represented as dwarves that acted as an HQ for Surtur's invading forces. And words of advice and a little spoiler here, if you're a hardcore fan, this is the area where you can find some of the most interesting documents in the DLC, featuring Juno, Baldr, Calder and his plans, which we're going to discuss today, Jupiter and more. As we mentioned in our previous video, Odin was looking for a symbol conveniently left on the ground for him to track down the Isu that acquired the Salakar artifact before him from the ancient vault of the Sun and the Moon. This Isu, whom we already described in the last video as Calder, a scientist with a penchant for testing on living subjects, this Isu had obtained a few of the local buildings in Atri for his studies, and that's where Odin goes to track him. In the main one, he finds out that Calder is looking for a notable Greco-Roman Isu and a notable North African Isu to complete his mission, which apparently was known to Surtur and his wife Sinmara only, and that involved binding only the most powerful consciences and essences within the Salakar, whose name Odin translates to Vessel of Souls. So here we kind of understand that the Salakar artifact, I'm not using the name Piece of Eden here because the Salakar dates much earlier than them, the Salakar seems to be a container of several different essences of various Isu, as we'll see later in detail. In a nearby house, we can even find a letter to Sinmara by Calder, where Calder seems to be enamored with Sinmara behind Surtur's back, but let's not dwell on that. What's interesting about this is that apparently the two have been considering which of the Jotun or Greco-Roman consciences could be the right and notable ones to store in the Salakar in order to complete Surtur's plan, which, you'll grow accustomed to this, is not really explained in the main story. The first hypothesis was Juno, who had been spotted in the area as she was fleeing from Jupiter and Minerva after helping Odin gain the 7th method of salvation and stealing it herself too, and he suggested Sinmara to send her chosen warriors against her. Keep this in mind as it will be key in understanding what Juno was doing in this area, though again we'll discuss this in a later video of this series. An alternative for that, according to Calder, would be a member of Suttungur's, or shall we say Jupiter's, Outriders, which are the generals that Jupiter sent to the territory described as Svartalfheim to oversee the war operations on the Greco-Roman side and spy on the North African side as well. The member in question would be Brokkr, who is the character that can be spotted in the secret area of the DLC under the dams, which can be accessed only by using the Jotun armor. And finally, Calder mentions a Greco-Roman Isu quote-unquote more powerful than either of these, called the right hand of Jupiter, who is Malvigr, the Greco-Roman Isu that Odin meets in his third mission, and as you might know, she is the one that eventually ends up in the Salakar. Once Odin completes his investigation, he is found by Asa, and that's where they start forming sort of an alliance against Surtur in order to understand what his real plans are. Eventually, Odin tracks Calder to another location where he is again performing the so-called ritual and thus testing the Salakar, this time as he is looking for a Muspel/North African Isu notable conscience to store in the artifact, and indeed he is planning to use it on one of Asa's generals. So Odin decides to get up close, disguised as one of the North North African Isu, and interestingly enough, Calder calls him Mad One and not just Havi or whatever, which prompted me originally to think that this was Loki in disguise, but nah. So Odin at last sees the Salakar artifact, but in a plot twist, Calder uses it on him directly, and while he does, Odin sees two images of his son Baldr, seemingly imprisoned within an oak tree and especially surrounded by mistletoe. In hindsight, considering that the Salakar is an artifact that stores the minds and souls of characters, this could mean that at this point Odin is already seeing Baldr's death, as it might have already happened. Or, alternatively, the Salakar can also show some calculations like the Apple of Eden, and at this point Baldr is still alive, but later in the story Sinmara does tell Odin that his son had been killed way before he found his body. Before moving on with the story though, now that we have actually encountered the Salakar, it is worth mentioning a theory that I think I've seen mentioned by our friend Claudio first about the artifact. That is that it looks like it's a portable version of the big glowing spheres attached to the pedestals that we have seen mainly in Assassin's Creed 3 and in Valhalla's main game. While they look visually similar, which could be the anchor point here, they also seem to have a similar function. The Salakar seems to be able to store a limited amount of Isu consciences inside of it and potentially to get them out at some point, while the glowing spheres too allowed Desmond and Layla's essences to be uploaded to the Grey and at the same time to get Juno's conscience out, as we can see in the ending of Assassin's Creed 3. So yes, it looks like the Salakar is a portable version of that, like a portable hard drive for Isu essences, if you will. Anyway, back to the story. Odin's conscience, or energy, is apparently too strong for the Salakar to consume, and thus he survives the impact, with Calder being pretty surprised but also recognizing his opponent. So Asa intervenes and starts chasing Calder, but she's weaker and alone against his soldier, so after a chase, Odin finds them and confronts Calder. At this point, the villain has changed his mind and has planned to take Asa's conscience within the Salakar to move on with his plan, even mentioning how much purity he saw in Baldr as he was torturing him. Another hint at Baldr potentially being already dead by now, but alas, Odin defeats him, and it's Asa who actually kills him by storing his conscience in the artifact, and maybe, potentially, this was possibly the suitable conscience of a North African Isu that was needed for the Salakar. But that's also where Odin decides to continue Calder's work by getting the conscience of more Isu inside the Salakar to make it complete, whatever that could mean, in order to have something that Odin can exchange actually for his son. This is where Asa and Odin actually seal their alliance, aimed at defeating Surtur no matter the cost, but Odin is still missing the conscience of a notable Greco-Roman Isu to complete the Salakar, and that's where the right hand of Jupiter, the Isu Malvigr that was mentioned in Calder's notes but we had never heard about, comes into play. So Odin and Asa part ways, with him suggesting to give her back the mini Salakar that apparently kept her alive but was also supposedly some kind of tracking device because she apparently shared a bond with it, and he goes back to the Jordigger shelter, where he talks to Fjalar and Galar, who in turn reveal to be the supposed but also unwilling assassins of Jupiter's father and his mother according to the legends and the database. In the usual mix of mythology and Isu's story, since his parents were killed, Jupiter had been looking for Fjalar and Galar and had sent Malvigr to Svartalfheim to hunt and kill them. Interestingly enough, they say that they had tried to provide some special mead in order to calm Jupiter, and it looks like they are talking about the 7 methods of salvation here, as if those two engineered or found who prototyped the 7th method and then brought it to Jupiter. But alas, Odin and Juno stole it, as we saw in the Jotunheim arc of the main game, and thus Jupiter chose to express his anger again on these two Isu by sending Malvigr after them. So Odin finds Malvigr close to one of the ice dams and also finds out that Fjalar and Galar had tried to set him up by telling her about his moves, but she had killed them anyway. The two get to talk about a previous fight between Malvigr and Odin's son Vidar before Malvigr shares what she knows about Surtur's plans thanks to her spies. That is, that Calder was tasked with finding the right souls and essences to sustain the Salakar, and that Calder's conscience was indeed trapped within it, and also that Odin wants to trap her in the artifact as well. She also tries her final hope, asking him to join her in order to foil Surtur's plans, but Odin's mind is already set, and so they proceed to fight, and once again Odin emerges victorious and extracts her conscience. And thus the Salakar is presumably complete? Because at this point, none of the characters still know how it works, and thus Odin decides to visit Ivaldi, hoping that he can help. But before that, you can read a letter written by Malvigr to Jupiter himself, which for some reason mentions for the first and last time the existence of dark elves in Svartalfheim just because. I guess it was an early plan, as Svartalfheim means home of the dark elves. And then in the same letter, Malvigr suggests the unthinkable, that is an alliance between the Asgardian Isu and the Greco-Roman ones in order to face Surtur, but alas that never came to fruition. So Odin reaches Ivaldi and shows him the Salakar, which he surprisingly recognizes even if there are no local legends about it. Odin again mentions how he and the Asgardians were weary after the war with the quote-unquote Vanir, and thus did not stop Surtur and the North African Isu from invading the ancient Isu territory represented by Alfheim and the people that lived in it. Apparently during that invasion, Surtur quote-unquote devoured their light, conscience by conscience, essence by essence, and possibly because of that, he's always been able to renew himself after death. So as we mentioned in our previous videos, beyond the mythological veil, it looks like these ancient Isu had some way, some technology that allowed them to be reborn after they died, or more likely to transfer their conscience and de facto renew themselves and live again, which is kind of mentioned as understanding of the sacred Hugr in one of the memory/loading screens. That's why Surtur invaded them and, after killing them and gaining hold of their knowledge and technology, has become an unkillable Isu, while also possibly granting a similar kind of tech to her daughter Asa with her amulet. Ivaldi even adds that during the conquest of these ancient Isu, Surtur might have also heard about the Salakars. That's a plural right there, but once again, they don't know what Surtur is planning to do with the artifact, even now that it has a notable Greco-Roman and a notable North African Isu conscience stored inside. And then Ivaldi pronounces a sentence that I would never have imagined to hear in Assassin's Creed, that is, "You deal with a fire nymph?" But again, here we are. So Asa says that she found out that Surtur was rebuilding something large and powerful, but wasn't he building something tiny and powerful just a story arc ago? And apparently the Salakar is meant to be part of this large and powerful object. The connection here is to the tower, which, as we'll see in our next videos, is indeed one of the towers from the first method of salvation from Assassin's Creed 3, and thus this shows that Surtur was rebuilding it for its own plans. But Surtur is apparently very keen on getting the complete Salakar first, so they are indeed ready to make an exchange for Baldr. So Odin gets prepared while giving her the amulet back so she's more protected, and in these moments, perhaps for the first time, Odin is thinking of getting the Salakar back after saving Baldr, because the 7 method solution that he's stolen and chosen to use to save himself from the great catastrophe is not ideal apparently, and he's wondering if the Salakar is offering another way, one that would allow him to save the people that he cares about. This is another one of the few moments in the DLC where Odin doesn't show to be so full of himself, which wasn't that bad at all. Odin's next steps are to find another shelter, called Hoda Shelter, which would have helped Ivaldi find the tools he needed to study the Salakar, and when he finds it, he discovers that Brokkr and Sindri, the dwarves/Isu that crafted some of the most famous artifacts like Mjolnir and Gungnir, again in the Isu era, they are still alive. He eventually meets Brokkr and finds out that Sindri has gone out to get some mead, so Odin goes to try and find him, but sadly discovers that he had already been captured and is already dead, killed by a previous use of the Salakar, possibly by Calder, because of the supposed quality of his conscience, which is deemed of no importance later on. Nonetheless, Odin carries the body back to his brother in what is at the beginning an act of honor, but is later turned by himself into a way to convince Brokkr to work with his former rival Ivaldi in order to understand what the Salakar is about. So classic Odin right there. So he lies to Brokkr as to how Sindri died as well, and then participates in his funeral, and even lies about him being in Valhalla, and eventually Brokkr caves and decides to work with Ivaldi to study the Salakar. But again, the tools needed weren't enough, and that's where Asa enters the scene, and you remember when I said that I would never have imagined to hear in Assassin's Creed a sentence like, "You deal with a fire nymph"? Well, would you have imagined to hear it twice? Thus, Asa brings news about Sinmara being interested in the Salakar versus Baldr trade, but apparently is lacking the will to do it, so Odin decides to weaken her stance and her war plans, but not before telling Ivaldi and Brokkr to find information about what the Salakar is about. So Odin thwarts Sinmara's plans within a shipyard where Surtur's forces had been building their naval effort, within a mill location where Sinmara was seemingly building an army of clones, or at least some machine-based bodies, which are here called empty muspel bodies and empty vessels, in which somehow they would have subsequently instilled life. And a nice comparison here was mentioned by Nate in our comments, who actually said that these could be similar to the Colossi humanoid machines shown in the Fate of Atlantis DLC for Odyssey. The final mission aimed at ruining Sinmara's war effort eventually led Odin to a smithy location where apparently she was building some kind of fast war machines, here represented by iron boars. After that, he finally gets back to the dwarves/Isu engineers to get some answers on the Salakar, and once again, he gets nothing. Even he is surprised by the nothingness everybody knows about this artifact, but to add more vagueness and confusion, Ivaldi states that the artifact contains more than Odin said, with them at least being able to sort of understand what kind of essences it does contain, and detecting a dwarf in there, but apparently they don't recognize its Sindri, or Sigrun and Halsin for that matter, and apparently for some reason the conscience of these Isu, the dwarves, doesn't carry much weight. So it seems that at this point the Salakar contains more than the conscience of Malvigr, Calder and Sindri, which might hint at the fact that Baldr might have already been killed with the Salakar, which in turn would explain why Odin even saw glimpses of him when he came in contact with the artifact. So Odin asks once again what the purpose of the Salakars, again plural there, is, and Ivaldi answers once again with some pretty vague answers. Hugr vitalized them, as in they were powered by storing consciences inside of them, but it was magic that gave them purpose, and that magic was different to each Salakar, which I absolutely have no idea what that means. We did see earlier that magic could mean energy or technology, and apparently Ivaldi says that it was something that was used by the Ancient Isu that no one knows anymore, aside from Surtur that is, but that's pretty much it. So to me the only info that we can gather here is that different Salakars apparently had different purposes based on their energy. Anyway, Brokkr mentions that Sinmara, after Odin's incursions, had seemingly accepted to barter Baldr for the supposedly complete Salakar. So Odin reaches the fortress where the trade was meant to be done, but he is of course tricked by a shape-shifting Greco-Roman Isu. I'd imagine they had some amazing disguise tech back then. Of course, Odin starts his chase to hoping to find Baldr or to retrieve the Salakar, and gets inside the fortress managed by Sinmara and finally reaches the torture room, and that's where he, along with all of us players, saw that Baldr had already been killed off screen. Again, I was pretty speechless when I found this. You spend 10 to 15 hours looking for him and he's being killed off screen. That is pretty bad in itself, and it was one of the things that bothered me the most about this DLC. Not only because Baldr's death is a famous event in the Norse mythology, but also because it was mentioned in detail in the Animus Anomalies of Valhalla's main game as an act organized and possibly handled by Loki himself. And it was pretty much the single, only piece of information that we knew about Baldr before the DLC, so this couldn't be missed. And instead it happens off screen, and this also leads me to believe that this was caused by some issues during the development cycle. It's likely that all of this happened because Loki was decided to not be part of Dawn of Ragnarok, and maybe that was caused by Ubisoft's rumored decision to turn an upcoming DLC into an equally rumored Assassin's Creed Rift project starring Basim, which required Carlo Rota's voice acting, meaning that his voice could not be used here. Whatever the case, the end result here is very, very bad. Anyway, the explanation of what happens here based on what we're seeing is that yes, the Isu invaders and Sinmara specifically knew about mistletoe being the one element to kill Baldr, and they torture him by forcing him to ingest several mistletoe drafts. It's not really clear what of this is actually part of the Isu meta story, considering that Baldr was indeed killed through the use of mistletoe in the Isu era, but what matters is that eventually his conscience too was stored in the Salakar. When that happened, it's not really explained. Like I said, I believe it happened very early on, as soon as the Salakar was acquired by Calder after he tortured him, but I don't think we're going to get any answer on that. so Sinmara is about to kill Odin as well, but Asa intervenes and thus Sinmara kills her. That was very fast, and then, like a proper villain, she doesn't take care of Odin herself, but has some minions try and do it, so Odin frees himself, of course, and finally unleashes his rage on everyone on his path, then chases her to the innermost room of the fortress, where he finally fights and kills her, and seemingly stores her conscience in the Salakar too. As he retrieves the Salakar, Odin weeps in front of it, where the conscience of his son Baldr is stored. At least that is kind of similar to what was mentioned in the Animus Anomalies, and then he starts seeing Sinmara, Calder, Glod, and Malvigr, and it seems like those are supposed to be the essences stored in the Salakar, but if that were the case, Glod shouldn't be supposed to be there. Otherwise, Odin is just seeing some of his enemies because they caused him pain? I don't know, whatever the case, he finally expresses all his rage by punching and hitting these visions or projections by the Salakar, who knows really, and in some frames it seems like we can see Eivor's face as she also feels the same rage while the actual Odin keeps crying in front of the Salakar. Honestly, despite the very bad and off-screen setup, this was a pretty good scene, where the player can even express their rage by hitting these four antagonists over and over again until the scene stops and Eivor wakes up. So at least there's that. And that was it for this episode of our analysis. What do you guys think of our interpretations of the events that we showed throughout the video? Do you agree or disagree with them? And do you believe that we missed something here? Let us know in the comments below. Also, join us in the next and potentially final episode of this series, where we're finally going to analyze the ending of the DLC, including the tower mentioned in Assassin's Creed 3, Surtur's plans for it, Juno's plans in Svartalfheim, and also some potential hints for the future. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.